We have a lot of people in media who listen to this show. We understand that a lot of you are busy and you're prepping and you're like, hey, what's significant out there that we need to be talking about? Here's what I would request. Because we don't get to go to the White House press briefing. Joe Biden's not going to talk to us. We don't get to talk to Dr. Fauci. We get to talk to all of you, millions of people every day. But here's what I would request for people out there who are listening that do get the opportunity to ask these questions. Ask the same question of Dr. Fauci and Jen Psaki and also of Joe Biden and Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director. I want to give credit here. This is on CNN, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. So for everybody out there who's like, oh, you're not a doctor. How dare you have an opinion on any medical issue whatsoever? You're killing grandmas, which is what Buck and I have been hearing for 18 months. We have been slamming this story on the radio show because both of us happen to have COVID. We recovered from it. There is zero discussion of maybe 100 million people out there, pretty decent percentage of the American population, maybe even higher, that have had COVID and have recovered from it. And there is Israeli data, which we talked about with all of you, that says that natural immunity, that is recovering from COVID, is up to 27 times as protective as vaccinated immunity. And last night, I believe this is, Dr. Sanjay Gupta was on with Anderson Cooper and the Fauchmeister himself. And I want you to listen to Sanjay Gupta directly asked Fauci about natural immunity and listen to Fauci's response. Play the cut.
There was a study that came out of Israel about natural immunity, and basically the headline was that natural immunity provides a lot of protection, even better than the vaccines alone. What are people to make of that? So as we talk about vaccine mandates, I get calls all the time. People say, I've already had COVID, I'm protected, and now the study says maybe even more protected than the vaccine alone. Should they also get the vaccine? How do you make the case to them?
You know, that's a really good point, Sanjay. I don't have a really firm answer for you on that. That's something that we're going to have to discuss regarding the durability of the response. The one thing the paper from Israel didn't tell you is whether or not, as high as the protection is with natural infection, what's the durability compared to the durability of a vaccine. So it is conceivable that you got infected, you're protected, but you may not be protected for an indefinite period of time. So I think that is something that we need to sit down and discuss seriously, because you very appropriately pointed out it is an issue. And there could be an argument for saying what you said.
There could be an argument. Clay, first of all, we know he's talking about durability of natural immunity. We know the durability of the vaccines is not very long because they have to get boosters, and that's already been established. So in what world should we make the assumption that the natural immunity is worse in terms of duration and durability even than the vaccines that we've already found out do not last very long? How
does it take 18 months for Fauci to be asked this? And credit to Dr. Sanjay Gupta for asking him on live television. How does he still not have an answer, Buck? All he's done for COVID for 18 months is talk about COVID. And when he finally gets asked after 18 months about natural immunity, his answer is, I don't have a really firm answer for you on that. What are you doing, Fauci?
Here's what it is.
I'm so angry about this.
I know. But the good news is we're right. So, yay. Everyone listening to us, he's admitting it's like Clay and Buck, as much as they are barbarous evildoers killing grandparents across America on the issue, the specific issue of the immunity that is conferred after a natural infection. He's saying we're correct. Okay, so that's great. Beyond that, though, Clay, the reason that he's like, I don't have an answer, I don't really know, is because this would create a hurdle for the policy they are ramming down everyone's throats right now. It would create an additional complication, and it would slow down the pushing the lemmings off the cliff, so to speak. Like, they want everyone to do it, and the last question's later.
You should be able to go out and get an antibody test like I have done, like you have done, Buck. And if you have antibodies naturally from a COVID infection, you should be able to present that in lieu of a vaccine and in lieu of needing to constantly get tested, because the data reflects that natural immunity is better than vaccinated immunity. Now, the cynic, Buck, would say the reason why Fauci is saying I don't have a really firm answer for you on that is not only because it complicates the situation and calls into question their vaccine mandates, it also creates a lot smaller business opportunity for Moderna and for Pfizer and for Johnson & Johnson, because it would pull 100 million Americans or so out of the required vaccination pool and also out of the required constant booster update.
And testing, by the way.
Testing as well.
Clay,
we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that this answer could potentially cost drug companies.
They are talking about test and trace again, even though at the beginning of the pandemic when they discussed this, because I would hear people say, oh, test and trace is really effective, for STDs, for syphilis. And I'd sit there saying, for most of us, it's a lot easier to give the list of who we might have had that issue with than who we've been in an elevator for 2 minutes with, right? For most of us, STD, test and trace is a very different thing than what you have for an aerosolized virus. Test and trace was a joke in this country with 100,000, with 50,000, with 10,000 cases a day. You're not tracing every person who's coming into contact with it, but they're trying to go back to it because, Clay, we've created the biosecurity theater state now. That's where we are, and it's all coming back together.
Now, I would say I asked for media that are listening to us that might be covering people in positions of power to ask about natural immunity. I also want to say this. We've got a lot of governors. We got a lot of representatives. We got a lot of senators and their staff or their staff that listen to this show as well. I think that the Ron DeSantis's and Greg Abbotts of the world, big state governors in Texas and Florida, need to start to talk about natural immunity as well and say, hey, we need to be testing to find out how many people have natural immunity. And if you're going to be saying, hey, get the vaccine or you get fired, you should certainly be able, if you're me or if you're you or if you're one of the other 100 million Americans like us who recovered from COVID out there, to say, hey, the data reflects that I have immunity. I can prove that I have antibodies. There's no need for me to get a vaccine, and you shouldn't be forcing me at penalty of losing my job to do so. So that is a middle ground that I think is a very fertile middle ground for a lot of politicians out there to be occupying as a part of rejecting this idea of vaccine mandates.
I think they are going to be pushing that direction. Enough people have kind of figured this out. People like you and me have been making a lot of noise about this for quite some time now because it's so obvious and such an important part of the discussion. But there are going to be still millions of people, and a lot of them listen to this show, who never had a positive COVID test, cannot prove antibodies through the blood test, and are still going to be affected by the vaccine mandate. So it doesn't make the problem go away.
It doesn't solve everything, but it
would be the first time, Clay, that they have had, that the lockdown or Fauciites have had to concede to scientific reality and effectively admit in real time that there's a huge gaping hole in their plan that they must address.
And let me just say this, too, for people out there who may not be following this perfectly. I had chickenpox. There now is a chickenpox vaccine. I have never gotten the chickenpox vaccine because I have natural immunity to chickenpox. I would imagine, Buck, you're probably the same. People of our age grew up and got chickenpox, and now my kids get a chickenpox vaccine, so they're never going to have it. But I've never been required as an adult to go get the chickenpox vaccine because I already have natural immunity to chickenpox. Just an idea for people to think about in their own lives that may be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I believe later on chickenpox can reassert itself as shingles, so even in that case, it can actually come back later. And, this is the world we live in of pathogens and viruses.